Okay, so today we are continuing from where we left off. The chapter
Auntie
is
Darwaza.
human nutrition or nutrition in humans, and right, we had talked about, let's see, the last thing we talked about was physical digestion. We talked about the structure of the teeth and how many teeth we have and what's the function of each of those, and swallowing and peristalsis. Before that, we've talked about balanced diet and the different components of a diet, including the three main ones, which are carbs, carbohydrates, proteins, and lipids, along with vitamins and then mineral ions, roughage, water, and all of that. So today we are going to continue forward with chemical digestion. And so, chemical digestion, as the name suggests, is the chemical breakdown of food from right larger or large molecules, not larger, to small molecules. That are easily absorbable. And so that's the whole aim. Right, you've got carbohydrates such as starch, which we know is a polysaccharide, and it's like a huge molecule made up of glucose monomer units, right? And you've got proteins made up of lots of amino acids, so that's a polymer as well. And then you've got lipids made up of fatty acids and glycerol, and none of these in their uh, you know polymer state or macromolecule state, because lipids are not polymers but they are macromolecules, like the large molecules, right? They cannot be directly absorbed. So physical digestion physically breaks down large chunks of food into smaller chunks, so that's easy to swallow, right? And can pass through the esophagus down into the stomach and all that. uh, right, and that's just the physical digestion that's happening in the mouth, right? We will come across two more uh, stages, or to two more areas where physical digestion occurs. Chemical digestion is chemically breaking it down. So starch is broken down into maltose, which is a disaccharide, and that is broken down into glucose, right? Not to say that glucose is the only kind of sugar we consume, but it is the major type of sugar that we consume. Proteins are, these are polypeptides, so really long chain. These are broken down into smaller chains called peptide molecules, and then those are broken down into amino acids. And then lipids are broken down into fatty acids and glycerol. And since we're talking about chemical reaction, there's some chemical reaction happening. So we know that there are links. So if this is a glucose molecule, right, and it's linked to another glucose molecule, and so you've got that bond, you've got bonds between amino acids, and then you've got bonds between, right, the fatty acid and the glycerol, and so the bonds need to be broken, and so that is a chemical reaction happening, and so that's chemical digestion. And they are carried out with the help of enzymes. So enzymes are something that we are very well familiar with. So, right, almost all, if not all, metabolic reactions, right? All the chemical reactions happening in the body are catalyzed by enzymes. So they're all enzyme catalyzed. And so the whole purpose of enzymes is that they speed up the process. Why? Because proteins can break down on their own, but it may take hundreds, maybe thousands of years, right? And we can't wait that long. If we're hungry and we had some eggs to eat, so those are a rich source of protein, and we can't wait for hundreds of years for that to break up and for us to be able to absorb it. And so enzymes are able to do that in a matter of an hour or two, right? That's it. So very quick process, and we can wait that long. Why? Because we've got some reserves of energy. It's not like we're completely depleted. So uh, digestion in is involves like sort of five processes as the book details, right? So is first ingestion, and ingestion basically means taking food into the mouth. So the process of eating. Then it is digestion, which is breaking up larger food particles or particles and molecules into smaller ones, so both physical and chemical digestion. Then you have absorption. So once digestion has occurred and you've got these small molecules, they are taken up into the bloodstream. That is absorption. Then you have the very important process of assimilation. And assimilation is basically using, right, the food in the body. And then the last process is egestion.
So, like, what's the difference between absorption and assimilation?
Absorption is like, if you put like a cloth or a sponge on water, it absorbs it, so it takes it in, but it's not using the water, is it? Right? So
Hmm.
after that digestion, right, we'll talk about it step by step, what happens in the body in the alimentary canal or the gut. And so when it finally reaches the small intestine, sorry, and right, it's all broken up into the glucose molecules or whatever other monosaccharides there are, maybe fructose, right, or galactose if you've taken milk. So and you've got the amino acids and the fatty acids. So they're taken in from the small intestine into the blood, from which it can be passed along the body. That is absorption. Assimilation is, for example, that the amino acids are taken to the cells, different, like all over the body, where they are then used to make different proteins in the cells, right? Different enzymes and proteins that work in the cells. Or glucose is used by the cells of the body for respiration to provide energy, along with oxygen that is also provided via the blood, right, which we get through the process of breathing from the lungs, right? So that is assimilation. Assimilation is actually using it up.
Okay.
And then we have egestion, which is the removal of undigested material, right? Undigested material is important. Why? Because I believe we've come across the term excretion earlier on. And so just to be clear, in the book, highlights that as well. When you use the term excretion, right, it is the removal of a metabolic waste product. What does metabolic mean? Basically, a, a waste product that is the body has as a result of different chemical reactions, as a result of different chemical reactions in the body. Right. On a side note, the term metabolic is used together to, right, sort of talk about two different kind of processes, which are anabolic and catabolic. Right now, these terms aren't used in your textbook, but I'm just telling you. So, what are, right? So, metabolic reactions or metabolic processes, that's made up of anabolic and catabolic. So, what are anabolic reactions? Those reactions or those processes are the ones that build complex molecules from simpler molecules. The processes that build complex molecules from simpler molecules. Right? An example is, right, the amino acids you get from digestion. Those are taken to cells and then they're used to build up different proteins in the cell. So this is an anabolic process. The other type of process is called catabolic. Right? And then these are the opposite. So these are the processes in which complex molecules are broken down into simpler ones. Right? Such as what we're talking about, digestion. And keep in mind, right, that these are chemical processes. Right? So we're talking about chemical reactions, not physical. Right? Meaning bonds are being made and bonds are being broken. Do you understand the difference between chemical and physical? I hope so.
Yeah.
Right? Okay. So, right, just to clarify, you can have a large chunk of bread and you can break it up physically and have like a slice of bread. Right? This contains starch. This also contains starch. So it has not been chemically broken down, it's just physically smaller. The chemical breakdown is to chemically break the bonds in the starch and then to turn it into maltose and then glucose. So that is chemical. Right, so when you talk about metabolic, it's a combination of anabolic plus catabolic. Metabolic also refers to chemical. So excretion, when you talk about excretion, coming back to the main point, is the removal of waste products as a result of metabolic reaction. Whereas egestion right, is a removal of waste that are not a result of any metabolic reactions.
So, like, excretion is not part of digestion process.
Excretion.
Yeah.
Uh, the digestion that we're talking about, no, not really. No, not like directly or immediately.
Okay.
Right, the end. Right. Interestingly, and I think we still have to cover that chapter. Uh, when you breathe out and when you have carbon dioxide in the air you breathe out, that carbon dioxide is the term, it's excreted from your body. Why? Because the carbon dioxide has been formed in your body as a result of metabolic processes and respiration, right?
Yeah.
So carbon dioxide is a waste product. There are other waste products that are removed via the kidney as urine, right? But then egestion, which is the stool that is passed from the body, is mostly undigested material, right? So it's just stuff that wasn't even digested chemically or whatever, right? So it's just waste that wasn't needed by the body and it's just removed.
Okay.
Okay. Now, uh, moving about a bit here and there, we have covered uh, some major concepts, I believe. So what I'm going to do right now, I'm going to show you the elementary canal in humans. That's the diagram in the book, so that we have an understanding of which organ is where, what's going on, and so we can talk about those in turn. Can you see the book?
Yeah.
Okay. Right. So it all starts with the mouth. In the mouth, you have the tongue. You have the epiglottis, which we've talked about. Right. It's the one that stops. It blocks the opening that's going into the lungs. And so the esophagus is actually behind your windpipe or the trachea. And so here's the esophagus coming down, going all the way into your stomach, right? The salivary glands are actually at the base of your tongue, right? So they're over here. And so food goes right down into the stomach, and from there, uh, it leads into the small intestine, right? So this tube that's going down, the small intestine has two parts. One is called the duodenum, and the other is called the ileum. So the duodenum is the part that comes first. The part that comes later is called the ileum. The small intestine, which is this long tube type thing, joins into this larger tube, right, which is sort of making a rectangle. And this is called the colon or the large intestine, right? Other stuff that we have, which is obviously important, you have the liver, right? You have the pancreas, which is very important. It produces many of the enzymes that are involved in the process of digestion. Then you have the gallbladder and the bile duct attached to the gallbladder, and that's also plays a role in digestion.
Also called bladder.
It is an organ.
Like, what's its function?
Its function is to produce and release bile, which travels a substance called bile, which travels via the bile duct. So you see that very thin tube, right? It travels via the
Yeah.
bile duct, and then it's attached to the duodenum, right? So the earlier part of the small intestine. So right, what it does, what bile does, we'll talk about that a bit later, right? And so with all of that, so in the small intestine, you have like your digestion, the chemical digestion is completed, and absorption occurs in the ileum, so the later part of the small intestine, and then water and undigested material is passed along into the colon, right? And that passes along and then finally reaches this part, which is the rectum. It collects over here, and then finally, right when it's filled up, it is removed through the anus, and that is the process of egestion. Okay, and yes, you need to know which organ is where, because there are many questions in MCQs particularly, right, but in paper 2 as well, where they give you like this diagram and they ask you, oh, what's organ, for example, they give you this thing, the gallbladder, and they ask you what's organ X or what's organ T, right? And so you need to know all of this, right? Any questions?
No.
Okay, now let's talk about what happens at each point of the alimentary canal in turn.
Like where the actual digestions like begins.
The mouth. Like when you say digestion, what are you referring to? Are you referring to physical digestion or chemical digestion?
Chemical digestion.
Mouth. Physical digestion, mouth. Both of them start in the mouth.
Oh.
Okay. So the mouth, right?
But like when we're talking about that where are the digestive enzymes, like they are in the pancreas, no?
The enzymes that are made in the pancreas are released into the small intestine where the last stages of digestion take place. Digestion begins in the mouth, it continues in the stomach, and then it's completed in the small intestine.
Okay.
Okay, but it's done in parts. So the mouth, right? This is where both physical and chemical digestion occur. Well, begin, sorry, not occur. Now we've talked about how physical digestion occurs in the mouth, the teeth and the chewing and everything. Let's talk about chemical digestion. What happens is the salivary glands, right? They have ducts or tubes via which saliva is released into the mouth, right? This saliva has many functions, right? So what it does is it uh, causes the food, like the chunks of smooth food, to stick together. So it makes the food being chewed sticky. And how is that important? So it normally like rolls up the food into sort of like a ball shape. Then, right, it lubricates it so that it's not hard and dry and rough. Uh, so it lubricates the food so it's easy to pass down the esophagus. And in terms of so this is right, not chemical digestion. This is the part where the chemical digestion is. It contains enzyme, the enzyme salivary amylase. And this enzyme begins, not completes, but begins the digestion, the chemical digestion of starch. Right, and it begins to break down starch to maltose. Okay. Any questions?
Yes. No.
Okay, so from there you swallow your food and your food travels down your esophagus to the stomach. Right, so in the stomach, you have both physical and chemical digestion taking place. Right, how is physical digestion taking place? Right, the movement of the stomach wall. What that does is it churns and mixes, right, the food with the gastric meaning stomach, gastric juices, right? It's called juices, but it's not a juice, right? So gastric juices or gastric fluids, right? And so that is physical digestion. Now, stomach walls are elastic. So when there's no food in the stomach, it's actually small, but when right food enters, right, the stomach walls expand to accommodate it, to accommodate the food. Of course, there's a limit to how much we can fill in. Now, this is the aspect of physical digestion. Chemical digestion. Right? The cells in the stomach, right? They release two things, right? So cells in the stomach lining, right? They're like these are done by different cells. They release two things. One is protease. Now remember, whenever you see ASE at the end of a name, that means it's an enzyme. Okay, and so this is an enzyme that breaks down proteins to peptides, which are shorter chains. So we're not at amino acids yet, right? So they break down proteins to enzymes. So
Peptides.
proteins are polypeptides. Peptides are shorter chain. Like proteins are long chain. Peptides are short chain,
Okay.
right? So if you've got something like, for example, 100, maybe it will break it down to like 20 and 30 or something, right? I'm just like, for the sake of explanation, I'm not saying this is the exact number, right? So that's one thing that's being produced by the stomach, and sorry, by the cells in the stomach lining. The other thing that's being produced is hydrochloric acid, right? And what this does is it gives an acidic medium, an acidic environment for the protease, because right, it has an optimum pH which is acidic. So it makes the environment in the stomach acidic so that the protease can function. That's one thing. Secondly, right, the hydrochloric acid kills harmful microorganisms that would otherwise cause food poisoning. Now, given from our experience in life that we still do end up with food poisoning, either you had like a lot of bacteria or whatever the microorganism they were, or they were very resistant to even the acidic conditions in the stomach, and that's why we end up getting sick, right? But as clean as the food may be, it doesn't matter how clean it is, there are still always microorganisms everywhere. Like you take absolutely anything, and you put it under a microscope and you'll see it is covered with microorganisms, right? So no matter how clean the food is, there's still going to be some microorganisms, and we don't fall sick all the time is because those microorganisms are killed in the stomach by the acid. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Now, right, the gastric secretions or the gastric juices or fluids are basically the protease and the hydrochloric acid, and it's an aqueous medium. It's watery, obviously, right? It's not dry in there. And so we should be able to understand that when we're saying fluid or juices, so it's obviously watery. You've got water in there as well. And right, with the process of digestion, with the process of churning, the physical and the chemical digestion, what you end up with is you get like a, as the book describes it, the food that you've eaten turns into sort of a liquid, creamy liquid form, right? And what this does is it increases the surface area of, right, what used to be your food, right? And we know that if the surface is increased, that means, right, it can be even more easily digested because there's more surface area available for the enzymes to act. Now, after that, what happens is that there is a muscle, a ring of muscles at the base of the stomach, as I showed you, and that is called the pyloric sphincter. Sphincter. Right, so this is like a ring of muscles, and what this does is it allows the liquefied food to pass into the duodenum, right, which is basically the beginning of the small intestine, right, and it stops solid or larger particles from going through which have not gone through that digestion process in the stomach. So stops larger particles or solids from going through, right? Any questions?
No.
Okay. So with that, uh, right, we reach the duodenum, and here, let me just put that down over here, duodenum, and over here the food goes through the final stages of digestion, right? And when you talk about food, right, it's all the three classes. You're talking about carbs, proteins, right, and lipids, all of them. And so the small intestine does not have produce any of its own enzyme, right? Like there was the salivary amylase in the mouth, and there was the protease in the stomach, right? Uh, the salivary amylase, small intestine doesn't have any of that. In fact, before I move on, there's something I'm missing. Right. So just one thing, the the protease in the stomach is called pepsin. There's a name for it. It's mentioned in the book, it's mentioned after, like later. I'm just, mentioning it now. We don't need to go back in circles. So the name of the enzyme in the stomach that breaks down proteins to peptides is called pepsin. Okay. Okay. Now, in the duodenum, right, you have pancreatic juices which have digestive enzymes. So pancreatic juices having, so pancreatic juices meaning that coming from the pancreas, having digestive enzymes, right, are uh, released into the duodenum. And so what are you doing for, right? Uh, you have proteases, you have, right, carbohydrate digesting enzymes, and you've got fat digesting. So let's talk about those, right? As far as the digestion of starch is concerned, right, you have pancreatic amylase. So digestion of starch. And so what you have is pancreatic amylase, and that breaks down starch to maltose, right? So not all the starch was digested in the stomach, right? Some of it is left, and so that is further broken down into maltose. As you know, maltose is a disaccharide. It's still too big, right? And we leave it this because something's going to happen later. Then you got the proteins, right? So you had peptides. Now for the proteins, you have trypsin. So in the pancreatic juice, you have the enzyme called trypsin. That's also a protease. And that breaks down the proteins again to peptides, right? So it's not the final stage, right? It's not still amino acids, it's peptides. The thing about trypsin dimension is it's initially released in an inactive form, and then in the small intestine it is activated, and then it does that.
What's an inactive? What is meant by an inactive form?
Inactive form meaning that it's, you know, it's an enzyme, but it's not, you know, ready to perform its function due to
Okay.
some reason, right? So of course the details are not part of your syllabus, uh, but it is inactive. So when it comes into the duodenum, it is activated. So now it's ready to, you know, digest the proteins and break them down to peptides, and that's what it does. Okay. Okay, and then you have the lipids. And so the pancreatic, right, juice, or yeah, they contain lipases which break down the lipids to fatty acids and glycerol. Now, before we move on, like, okay, fine, let's do that. So, right, we need to talk about the structure of the small intestine a bit, right? The small intestine, especially like the ileum part, right? So the later part, the ileum, right? It is long, and that increases surface areas, that provides more surface area, and the walls, the inner walls are very much folded, right? So they're folded, and that increases the surface area even further. And the surface of the walls, so if this is like, you know, one of the folds, it has these finger like projections on the surface, right? These are called villi for plural, or villus for singular. That increases the surface area even more. And right, on top of that, they have even smaller projections called microvilli. So you can imagine the level of folding and the very, very, very large surface area that is, right, provided in the ileum for the absorption. So there's a very large surface area provided for absorption. Now, absorption is not the only thing that's going on, right? We, right, fats like lipids have been digested, fatty acids and glycerol. But what about the maltose and the peptides? So when the food reaches the ileum, right, the cells of the epithelial of the ileum, so cells of epithelial of the ileum contain enzymes to complete the digestion of, right, maltose and the peptides. So as far as maltose is concerned, right, they have the enzyme maltase, and then so that's broken down into glucose. Okay, and for the peptides, they have the enzymes peptidase, and that breaks it down to amino acids. And then, right, along with the fatty acids and glycerol, all of these are absorbed, right, first by the cells of the epithelial, cells of the epithelial lining of the ileum, and from there they are, they've moved to the blood, and then they are transported away. Any questions?
No.
Okay. Now, with the few minutes we have left, right, let's talk about bile, right? So, bile is not produced by the gallbladder, bile is actually produced in the liver, right? And it has bile pigments, right, which are, breakdown products, these pigments are obtained by the breakdown of red blood cells, or more, specifically hemoglobin, right? And so it is like, because of the bile pigments, it's greenish in color. Now the liver produces the bile and it stores it in the gallbladder. And so when it's required, when there's food in the small intestine, from the gallbladder via the gall duct, right, it is given up, like it is released into the duodenum. Now what bile does, it has a role in physical digestion. How? It causes the emulsification of lipids. If you remember back when we were talking about biological molecules and we did the food tests, if you remember, we took we dissolved some food in ethanol, and then we added water to it, and it emulsified. And so emulsification is basically turning the lipids into small droplets, right? And what that does, it increases the surface area of the lipids, right, to make it easy to digest. So this is the role bile plays in physical digestion with regards to the lipids that we consume. Then it has a role in chemical digestion. And what's that? Right? So bile is alkaline. So it has two roles. One, it neutralizes the stomach acid. So when food is passing from the stomach into the small intestine, obviously the acid that was used is also going along. And we don't want an acidic environment in the small intestine. The environment in the small intestine is alkaline. So it neutralizes the acid and it provides a slightly alkaline environment, right, which is optimum for pancreatic enzymes. The pancreatic enzymes like alkaline environment, alkaline pH, right? And so if it were acidic, they wouldn't work. So it gives that alkaline environment. I think it's mentioned around pH 8 in, right? And so that's what you get, and that's the role bile plays in chemical digestion. Any questions?
No.
Right. And then finally, right, from the ileum and the colon. So in the ileum, as you already mentioned, absorption of all the digested materials takes place. And then undigested uh, matter and water pass into the colon, right, which is the large intestine. Right now, the undigested matter is mostly roughage, which we talked about. So that's plant matter, the cellulose and everything which the body cannot digest. But bacteria in the large intestine uh, are able to digest some of the cellulose to make like some fatty acids, right? So that's like, it's not us doing it technically, it's the bacteria in our large intestine. And then a lot of the water is reabsorbed. So reabsorption or absorption. So why am I saying like absorption and reabsorption? Because some like the water we drink or that's in the food that we eat, that's absorbed. And then you have, all the enzymes being released. So there's water with the salivary amylase, there's water with the pancreatic juices, there's water with the gastric juices, right? So there's water everywhere. And so nearly 7 liters of water is utilized during digestion every day. And so if we're losing 7 liters of water just because of digestion, we're going to be dehydrated all the time, right? And so most of that water, like the majority of that water, is reabsorbed. It's not like 100%. That's why we need to keep drinking water as well. But the majority of that water is reabsorbed in the large intestine, right? And then whatever is left over, right, is excreted. Well, again, not excreted, but removed, right? And that is egestion. I already mentioned how that happens. So, just a few things left to talk about, and primarily about right, absorption and assimilation. So we'll do that tomorrow, and then we'll move on to the next chapter, which is human gas exchange. So we'll talk about breathing. Any questions?
No.
All right, then I'll see you next class, Michelle.
I love this.
Allah Hafiz.